Maria Santos wiped her hands on her apron as she watched the evening rush begin to slow down at her small family restaurant. Abuela's kitchen. The warm glow of the overhead lights cast dancing shadows across the red checkered tablecloths, and the smell of fresh tortillas and simmering beans filled the air. She had inherited this little corner establishment from her grandmother 3 years ago, and every day felt like a battle to keep the doors open. The restaurant sat on the edge of downtown, where gentrification was slowly creeping in, pushing out longtime residents and small businesses like hers. Maria had grown up in this neighborhood, watching her grandmother serve hearty meals to construction workers, office clerks, and anyone else who needed a good meal at a fair price. Now, at 32, she was determined to carry on that tradition. Even though the rising rent and increasing competition from trendy cafes made it increasingly difficult, as she counted the day's earnings behind the register, Maria noticed the familiar figure outside her window again. For the past 3 weeks, she had seen the same man sitting on the bench across the street. He appeared to be in his 50s, with weathered skin and clothes that had seen better days. His military-style jacket, though faded and torn in places, suggested he might be a veteran. Every evening he would sit there quietly, sometimes reading an old paperback book, other times just watching the world go by. What struck Maria most about the man was his posture. Despite his obvious circumstances, he sat with dignity, his back straight and his eyes alert. There was something in his demeanor that reminded her of her late father, who had also served in the military. Her father had always taught her that respect and kindness cost nothing but meant everything. Tonight was different, though. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a light rain had begun to fall. Maria watched as the man pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, but he made no move to seek shelter. Other pedestrians hurried past with umbrellas and heavy coats, but he remained on the bench, seemingly resigned to weather the storm. Maria's heart ached as she watched him. She thought about her comfortable apartment above the restaurant, her warm bed and the leftover food that would likely go to waste if not eaten soon. Her grandmother had always said that food was meant to be shared, especially with those who needed it most. "Mija," she would say, "when you have enough to eat, you have enough to share." The dinner crowd had completely died down now, with only 2 regular customers finishing their coffee at the corner table. Maria's cook, Roberto, was already cleaning the kitchen, and her part-time waitress had gone home for the night. She found herself repeatedly glancing out the window at the man on the bench, watching as the rain began to fall harder. Making a sudden decision, Maria walked into the kitchen and began preparing a plate. She spooned generous portions of her signature chicken and rice, added some black beans, fresh avocado slices, and warm tortillas. The aroma reminded her of countless family dinners where her grandmother would always set an extra place at the table, just in case someone unexpected showed up hungry. Roberto looked up from the grill he was scrubbing. "Boss, what are you doing?" "We're closed." "Just making a plate for someone who needs it," Maria replied, adding a small container of her homemade salsa verde to the takeout bag. Roberto nodded approvingly. He had worked for Maria's grandmother for over a decade and understood the family's philosophy about helping others. "That's good, Maria. Abuela would be proud." Maria grabbed a large cup and filled it with hot coffee, adding cream and sugar packets to the bag. She also included some of the fresh bread rolls that hadn't been served during dinner. As she prepared everything, she felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. She didn't know how the man would react to her offer, but she knew she had to try. Putting on her rain jacket, Maria carefully carried the warm meal across the street. The man looked up as she approached, his eyes showing surprise but no fear. Up close, she could see that he was probably younger than she had initially thought, maybe mid-40s, but life had clearly been hard on him. His eyes were a striking blue, intelligent and alert despite his circumstances. "Excuse me," Maria said softly, her heart pounding. "I own the restaurant across the street, and I noticed you've been sitting out here in the rain. I thought you might be hungry." The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he stood up. "Ma'am, I appreciate the thought, but I don't take charity." His voice was clear and educated, with a slight southern accent. Maria was struck by his politeness and the pride evident in his refusal. "It's not charity," she said quickly. "It's just one neighbor helping another. My grandmother always taught me that food tastes better when it's shared." The man hesitated, looking down at the bag in her hands and then back at her face. She could see him struggling with something internal, pride warring with obvious hunger. Besides, Maria added with a gentle smile, I made too much food tonight, and it would just go to waste otherwise. You'd actually be helping me out by taking it. Something in her tone seemed to reach him. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time, she saw a hint of a smile on his weathered face. In that case, he said quietly, I suppose I could help you with your surplus food problem. Maria handed him the bag and coffee, and he accepted them with obvious gratitude. Thank you, miss. This is very kind of you. I'm Maria, she said, extending her hand. James, he replied, shaking her hand firmly. James Mitchell. Well, James, you're welcome at Abuela's kitchen anytime. We open at 7 in the morning. As Maria walked back to her restaurant, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with escaping the rain. She had no idea that this simple act of kindness would change both their lives forever, or that James Mitchell carried secrets that would soon turn her small world upside down. The next morning arrived with crisp autumn air and the promise of a busy day ahead. Maria unlocked the front door of Abuela's kitchen at exactly 7 o'clock, just as she had every morning for the past 3 years. The familiar ritual of turning on lights, starting the coffee machines, and setting up tables provided comfort in its routine. She had slept surprisingly well the night before, thinking about her encounter with James Mitchell as she arranged fresh flowers on each table, a tradition her grandmother had started decades ago. Maria found herself wondering about James's story. There had been something in his eyes, a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond what his current circumstances suggested. His military bearing and educated speech hinted at a past very different from his present situation. Roberto arrived 30 minutes later, carrying fresh vegetables from the morning market. A stout man in his 50s with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes, he had been like an uncle to Maria since childhood. He immediately noticed her unusually thoughtful mood. You're thinking about that man from last night, aren't you? Roberto asked as he tied his apron around his waist. Maria nodded, continuing to arrange the tables. There was something about him, Roberto. He reminded me of Papa in some ways. That same dignity, you know? Your father was a good judge of character, Roberto said, beginning his morning prep work. If this James reminded you of him, then he's probably worth knowing. The morning breakfast crowd began filtering in around 8 o'clock. Maria served coffee to the construction workers heading to nearby job sites, prepared breakfast burritos for the nurses finishing their night shifts at the hospital, and chatted with the elderly regulars who came in for their daily dose of community, along with their meals. Around 9:30, just as the breakfast rush was winding down, Maria looked up from the register to see James Mitchell standing hesitantly outside the front door. He was clean-shaven now, and his clothes, while still worn, were neat and tidy. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity she had noticed the night before. But there was uncertainty in his posture as he looked through the window. Maria walked to the door and opened it with a welcoming smile. Good morning, James. Come in, please. I don't want to intrude, he said carefully. I just wanted to return this and thank you again. He held out the empty food container from the night before, cleaned, spotless. You're not intruding at all, Maria assured him, taking the container. Have you had breakfast yet? James shook his head. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing, Maria interrupted gently. Please sit wherever you're comfortable. James chose a small table near the window, the same spot where he could see the bench where he had been sitting. Maria brought him a menu, but he politely declined it. Just coffee would be fine, thank you. Maria poured him a fresh cup and set it down along with cream and sugar. The breakfast special today is huevos rancheros with fresh fruit. It's really good. I'm sure it is, but coffee is plenty for me. Roberto, who had been watching the interaction from the kitchen pass-through window, caught Maria's eye and nodded toward the plate he was preparing. Understanding his signal, Maria returned to James's table. James, I hope you don't mind, but Roberto made an extra breakfast special this morning. His wife is on a diet, so he can't take it home, and I've already eaten. Would you mind helping us out again? James looked up at her, and she could see him processing her words. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. You know, I'm beginning to think you folks have a serious problem with making too much food around here. It's a terrible habit, Maria agreed with a grin. We really need help managing our portion control. This time, James accepted the meal without further protest. As he ate, Maria noticed his impeccable table manners and the way he savored each bite as if it were a gourmet meal. When she brought him a second cup of coffee, he looked up at her with genuine gratitude. "This is exceptional food," he said. "Your grandmother trained you well." "You knew this was my grandmother's place?" "The name kinda gave it away," James said with a slight chuckle. "But also there's a warmth here that only comes from generations of care. You can feel it in the food, in the way the place is arranged, even in how you treat strangers." Maria was touched by his observation. "She would have liked you," she said softly. "Abuela always said you could tell a person's character by how they treated food and how food treated them back." "Wise woman," James said, finishing the last of his breakfast. "This meal reminds me of Sunday mornings when I was growing up. My mother made something similar." "Where was that?" Maria asked, genuinely curious. "North Carolina," James replied, then seemed to catch himself before saying more. "Small town. Not much different from this neighborhood, actually." Before Maria could ask any follow-up questions, the lunch prep began demanding her attention. James insisted on paying for his coffee, leaving a tip that was probably more than he could afford. As he prepared to leave, Maria touched his arm gently. "James, I hope you'll consider this your neighborhood spot. Everyone needs a place where they feel welcome." Something flickered across his face at her words, an emotion too quick to identify. "You're very kind, Maria, thank you." Over the next several days, James became a regular fixture at Abuela's kitchen. He would arrive each morning around 9:30, always ordering just coffee but graciously accepting the extra meals that Maria and Roberto seemed to frequently prepare. He was unfailingly polite to all the staff and other customers, often engaging in thoughtful conversations about current events, books, or local history. The other regulars began to warm up to him as well. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who came in every Tuesday for lunch, discovered that James spoke some Mandarin from his travels. Tom, a retired teacher who spent his mornings reading the newspaper at the corner table, found in James someone who could discuss literature and philosophy with surprising depth. But it was James's interaction with Miguel, a shy 10-year-old boy who came in after school with his mother, that really showed Maria who he was beneath the surface. Miguel had been struggling with his math homework one afternoon, when James quietly offered to help. With infinite patience and a teaching ability that seemed natural, James helped Miguel understand concepts that had been frustrating him for weeks. "Were you a teacher?" Maria asked James after Miguel and his mother had left, the boy beaming with newfound confidence. James paused in stirring his coffee. "I've taught a few things in my time," he said carefully. "Not in a classroom exactly, but I've had opportunities to help people learn." Each day brought small revelations about James Mitchell, but also more questions. He clearly had education and intelligence that suggested a professional background, yet he remained homeless and seemed to have no family or support system. He never asked for anything beyond what was offered, maintained his dignity in all circumstances, and showed kindness to everyone he met. Maria found herself looking forward to their morning conversations more than she cared to admit. There was something about James that made her feel like she was getting to know someone truly special, even as she sensed there were significant parts of his story he wasn't sharing. She had no idea how dramatically her perception of him was about to change, or how the simple act of feeding a hungry man would lead to discoveries that would shock everyone who knew them both. 2 weeks had passed since James Mitchell first walked into Abuela's kitchen, and he had become as much a part of the morning routine as the fresh coffee and warm tortillas. Maria found herself setting aside portions during the morning prep, knowing that James would arrive precisely at 9:30, and that despite his protests, he would eventually accept whatever extra food happened to be available. On this particular Tuesday morning, the autumn rain was falling steadily against the restaurant windows, creating a cozy atmosphere inside. The usual breakfast crowd had come and gone, leaving behind the comfortable quiet that Maria treasured. James sat at his regular table by the window, reading a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird while nursing his second cup of coffee. Maria was wiping down tables when she noticed 3 men in expensive suits enter the restaurant. They looked out of place among the working-class clientele, their tailored clothing and confident bearing suggesting they were from the business district downtown. The tallest of the 3, a man with silver hair and sharp eyes, scanned the room methodically before his gaze settled on James. "Excuse me," the silver-haired man approached Maria. We're looking for someone, and we were told he might frequent this establishment. Goes by James Mitchell, probably in his mid-40s, military background. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The man's tone was professional, but carried an undertone that made her protective instincts kick in. She glanced toward James's table and saw that he had gone completely still, his book forgotten in his hands, his entire body tense with what looked like recognition and something that might have been fear. "I'm sorry, but I don't give out information about my customers," Maria said firmly, positioning herself between the men and James's table. The second man, younger with dark hair and an impatient expression, stepped forward. "Ma'am, this is important. We're from the Department of Defense and we need to speak with Mr. Mitchell about a matter of national importance." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Department of Defense? National importance? She looked back at James, who had slowly closed his book and was now watching the men with an expression she had never seen before. Gone was the gentle, humble man she had come to know. In his place sat someone with steel in his eyes and a bearing that suddenly made perfect sense. "James?" Maria called softly. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that commanded immediate attention. "Gentlemen, I thought I made it clear through proper channels that I was not available for consultation." The silver-haired man stepped around Maria, his demeanor respectful but urgent. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm sorry to disturb your sabbatical, but we have a situation that requires your specific expertise." Colonel Mitchell. The words echoed in Maria's mind as she watched this transformation unfold before her eyes. The humble, homeless veteran she had been feeding was actually a colonel. The implications began crashing over her like waves. "Agent Harrison." James acknowledged the silver-haired man with a slight nod. "I told Director Williams 6 months ago that I was done. My resignation was accepted and my security clearances were transferred to inactive status. Sir, with respect, some situations transcend retirement," the younger man interjected. "We have a code yellow situation developing and frankly, you're the only person with the necessary background to handle it." James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the three men and then to Maria, who stood frozen, trying to process what she was hearing. Code yellow? Security clearances? Who exactly was James Mitchell? "Not here," James said finally. "Give me 5 minutes." The three men nodded and moved to wait by the entrance. James turned to Maria, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. The man who had gratefully accepted her food and friendship now looked like someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. "Maria, I owe you an explanation," he said quietly, moving closer to her. "You're a colonel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And these men are from the Department of Defense." "Yes," James confirmed simply. "Though it's more complicated than that." "How much more complicated?" James glanced toward the men waiting by the door, then back to her. "I spent 22 years in the military, the last 8 in specialized operations. I retired 6 months ago after my wife died. Lost everything that mattered to me and I needed to figure out who I was when I wasn't wearing a uniform." The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. Wife, specialized operations? This man who had been sitting on a bench across from her restaurant, accepting her charity, was someone with a history she couldn't even begin to imagine. "So you've been lying to me," she said, hurt evident in her voice. "No," James said firmly. "Every conversation we've had, every moment of gratitude I've expressed, every word of appreciation for your kindness has been completely genuine. I never lied to you, Maria, I just didn't tell you everything." "There's a difference?" James looked at her intently. "When I lost Sarah, my wife, I lost myself too. Everything I had been, everything I had worked for, it all felt meaningless. I needed to remember what it felt like to be human again. Not just a rank and a mission. These past 2 weeks, sitting in your restaurant, talking with you and Roberto and your customers, it's the first time in months that I've felt like James the person instead of Colonel Mitchell the weapon." Maria struggled to reconcile the two versions of the man standing before her. The humble, grateful stranger who had become part of her daily routine was the same person these government agents were treating with obvious deference and respect. "What kind of specialized operations?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The kind that kept people safe by handling situations before they became public knowledge," James answered carefully. "The kind that required making decisions most people never have to make, carrying responsibilities that—" He paused, looking out the rain-streaked window. That eventually cost me everything that mattered. Agent Harrison approached them again, his impatience barely contained. "Colonel, we really do need to brief you on the situation. Time is a factor." James nodded but kept his eyes on Maria. "I need you to know that every moment I've spent here has been real. Your kindness, your grandmother's restaurant, the way you've treated me like a human being instead of a case file or a mission parameter. It's meant more to me than you could possibly know." "Are you leaving?" Maria asked, surprised by how much the thought frightened her. "I don't know," James admitted. "That depends on what they need and whether I can actually help. But Maria, regardless of what happens next, I want you to understand something important." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn wallet, extracting a business card that looked like it had been handled many times. He placed it on the table between them. "This is who I was," he said quietly. "But who I am, who I want to be, that's something I've been figuring out one morning at a time in your restaurant." Maria looked down at the card. The official Department of Defense seal was embossed at the top, and below it read, "Colonel James R. Mitchell, Strategic Operations Division, Classified Operations Unit." When she looked up again, James was walking toward the door with the 3 agents. At the threshold, he turned back one more time. "Thank you, Maria, for everything." And then he was gone, leaving Maria standing in her grandmother's restaurant, holding a business card that suggested the man she thought she knew was someone entirely different, someone whose past was apparently important enough to interrupt his self-imposed exile for matters of national security. Maria stared at the business card for nearly an hour after James left with the government agents. The embossed seal felt substantial under her fingers, and the weight of the thick cardstock suggested it was the real thing. Roberto had emerged from the kitchen shortly after the men departed, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand that their morning regular was not who they had believed him to be. "Strategic Operations Division," Maria read aloud for the 3rd time. "What do you think that means?" Roberto shook his head, refilling her coffee cup without being asked. "I think it means our James has been carrying some heavy burdens, and maybe that's why he ended up on that bench across the street." The lunch crowd began arriving, providing a welcome distraction from the questions swirling in Maria's mind. She served customers with her usual warm efficiency, but her thoughts kept returning to the transformation she had witnessed. The way James had carried himself when he recognized the agents, the authority in his voice, the respect those men had shown him, it painted a picture of someone far removed from the humble man who had been gratefully accepting her daily offerings of food. That evening, as Maria was closing the restaurant, she found herself researching military ranks on her phone. A colonel was no small position, she learned. It typically required decades of service and represented leadership over thousands of personnel. The Strategic Operations Division, however, proved more elusive in her searches. Most references were heavily redacted or classified, mentioning only that such units handled sensitive national security matters. The next morning, Maria arrived early and prepared breakfast as usual, but the routine felt hollow without James's anticipated arrival. She caught herself glancing at his regular table every few minutes, expecting to see him settling in with his worn paperback book and grateful smile. The other regulars noticed his absence. "Two?" Mrs. Chen asked about the nice gentleman who helped with her English pronunciation, and Tom mentioned missing their discussions about literature. 3. Days passed without any word from James. Maria tried to convince herself that she wasn't worried, that he was simply a customer who had moved on, but the truth was more complicated. Over the past 2 weeks, James had become more than just someone she fed out of kindness. His morning presence had become something she looked forward to, and his sudden disappearance left an unexpected void in her daily routine. On Thursday afternoon, while Maria was updating the weekly menu, a different kind of visitor entered Abuela's kitchen. This time it was a woman in her 30s, professionally dressed but with a warmer demeanor than the agents who had taken James away. She approached the counter with a genuine smile. "Excuse me, are you Maria Santos?" "Yes, I am." "How can I help you?" "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I'm a psychologist with the Veterans Administration." "I understand you've been helping a veteran named James Mitchell." Maria's heart skipped. "Is he all right? Did something happen to him?" Dr. Chen's expression softened. "May I sit down?" I'd like to talk with you about James, if you're willing. They settled at James's usual table by the window. Dr. Chen pulled out a small notebook but left it closed on the table between them. James is physically fine, she began, but I think you should understand more about his situation. He's given me permission to share some details with you, which is actually quite significant. James doesn't usually allow people into his personal circle. What kind of details? James retired from military service 6 months ago after losing his wife Sarah to cancer. She was also named Sarah, which is why he remembers me easily, Dr. Chen explained with a sad smile. He had served for over 2 decades, most recently in positions that required him to make life and death decisions affecting international security. When Sarah died, James experienced what we call a complete identity crisis. Maria leaned forward, finally getting answers to questions that had been haunting her for days. James's military career was extraordinary, Dr. Chen continued. He was what we call a strategic operations specialist. Think of him as someone who prevented international incidents before they became public knowledge. His decisions affected global stability and the pressure was immense. So what was he doing on a bench outside my restaurant? After Sarah's funeral, James walked away from everything. He liquidated his assets, gave most of his money to veterans' charities, and basically disappeared. He was trying to figure out who he was when he wasn't Colonel Mitchell, when he wasn't responsible for other people's lives, when he wasn't carrying state secrets. The picture was becoming clearer, but it raised new questions. The men who came for him, was that about going back to active duty? Dr. Chen shook her head. James is officially retired and can't be recalled to active duty. But there are situations where his specific expertise becomes invaluable for consultation. 3 days ago, he was asked to provide strategic advice on a developing situation. He agreed to help, but only as a civilian consultant. Where is he now? That's actually why I'm here, Dr. Chen said, opening her notebook for the first time. James is in Washington, D.C., working with a crisis management team. The situation is resolved now, but during the consultation, something interesting happened. Maria waited, sensing this was important. James told his colleagues about this restaurant. About you specifically. He said that the kindness you showed him reminded him why the work he used to do mattered, that there were people worth protecting, communities worth preserving. The words hit Maria like a warm wave. He said that? He said more than that. James told them that sitting in your restaurant every morning, being treated like a regular person instead of a military asset, helped him remember who James Mitchell was before he became Colonel Mitchell. He credits you with helping him find his way back to himself. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. I just gave him food. I didn't do anything special. That's exactly what made it special, Dr. Chen said gently. James spent years having people treat him as a rank, a resource, a weapon to be deployed. You treated him as a human being who deserved basic kindness. For someone who had lost his sense of personal worth, that meant everything. Is he coming back? Dr. Chen smiled. That's the other reason I'm here. James wanted me to tell you that he'll be returning tomorrow morning, but he wanted you to know who he really is before he walks through that door again. He was worried that knowing about his background might change how you see him. Maria thought about this for a moment. Will it change how he sees himself? I think it already has. The consultation in Washington reminded James that his skills and experience have value, but your restaurant reminded him that he has value as a person, separate from his professional abilities. He needs both parts of that equation to be whole again. Dr. Chen stood to leave, then paused. Maria, I want you to know that what you did for James, the simple act of feeding him and treating him with respect, it quite literally saved his life. When he first came to see me 6 months ago, he was in a very dark place. The fact that he's now ready to reintegrate his military experience with his personal identity, that's a huge step forward, and you were a crucial part of that journey. After Dr. Chen left, Maria sat alone in the restaurant as evening shadows grew longer. Tomorrow James would return, but now she understood the weight he had been carrying and the significance of the simple kindness she had shown. She realized that while she had been thinking she was helping a homeless veteran, she had actually been helping a highly decorated military officer find his way back to being human again. The thought was both humbling and inspiring, and as she prepared to close the restaurant for the night, Maria found herself looking forward to tomorrow morning with a mixture of anticipation and newfound respect for the remarkable man who would soon be sitting at the table by the window once again. Friday morning arrived with crisp air and clear skies, a perfect autumn day that seemed to match Maria's improved mood. She had spent the previous evening thinking about her conversation with Dr. Chen, and by morning she had reached a conclusion that surprised her with its clarity. James Mitchell, whether he was a homeless veteran or a decorated colonel, was still the same man who had shown kindness to Miguel with his homework, who had engaged Mrs. Chen in patient conversation, and who had brought a quiet dignity to her restaurant every morning. She prepared the restaurant for opening with extra care, arranging fresh flowers on each table and making sure James's favorite spot by the window was perfect. Roberto arrived early and immediately noticed her improved spirits. "You're expecting our friend back today," he observed, tying his apron with a knowing smile. "Dr. Chen said he would be here this morning," Maria confirmed, unable to hide her anticipation. "And you're okay with everything you learned about him?" Maria paused in her morning preparations. "You know what I realized last night? James never pretended to be anything other than who he is. He was always polite, always grateful, always treated everyone with respect. The fact that he used to be a colonel doesn't change the man who sat at that table and made Miguel feel confident about his math homework." Roberto nodded approvingly. "Your grandmother always said that people's hearts don't change just because you learn about their past." At exactly 9:30, Maria looked up from the register to see a familiar figure approaching the front door. James Mitchell looked different than he had a week ago, not physically but in his bearing. He still wore the same worn clothes, but there was something more settled about him, as if he had made peace with something that had been troubling him. When he entered the restaurant, James paused and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze found Maria behind the counter, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the room. Then James smiled, the same gentle expression she had grown accustomed to, and walked to his regular table. Maria approached with a fresh cup of coffee, her heart beating faster than usual. As she set the cup down, James looked up at her with an expression that held both gratitude and uncertainty. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to come back," he said quietly. "Why wouldn't I want you to come back?" Maria asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Because now you know who I really am. What I used to do, the kind of responsibilities I carried." James wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup. "I thought it might change things." Maria considered this carefully. "James, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "That first night when I brought you food in the rain, were you hungry?" "Yes." "Were you grateful for the meal?" "More than you could know." "Have you enjoyed our morning conversations?" "They've been the best part of my day for weeks." "Then nothing has changed," Maria said simply. "You were hungry, I fed you. You needed a place to feel welcome, and you found one here. Everything else is just details." James stared at her for a long moment, and she could see something ease in his expression. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. My grandmother used to say that complicated problems usually have simple solutions. But people make them complicated because simple solutions don't feel important enough." "Your grandmother sounds like she would have made a good military strategist," James said with a slight laugh. "She survived the Depression and raised 5 children as a single mother. Trust me, she knew about strategy." Roberto appeared with a plate of his special breakfast, setting it down in front of James without comment. James looked at the plate, then up at Roberto. "Let me guess, you made too much again?" "Terrible habit," Roberto confirmed with a grin. "My wife is still on that diet." As James began eating, Maria found herself studying his face. The tension that had been there before was gone, replaced by something that looked like peace. Dr. Chen had been right. He did seem to have found a way to integrate the different parts of himself. "Can I ask what happened in Washington?" Maria ventured. James paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "I helped prevent something bad from happening. I can't give you details, but I can tell you that it reminded me why the work I used to do mattered." "And how did that feel?" "Good, scary but good. I realized that trying to forget everything I learned over 22 years of service wasn't the answer. Those skills, that experience, it's part of who I am. I just needed to figure out how to be James the person and Colonel Mitchell the professional, without losing myself in either role." Maria nodded. "And sitting here helped with that?" "Sitting here reminded me that I'm worth caring about as a person, not just as a set of skills and clearances." When you brought me that first meal, you didn't know anything about my background and you didn't care. You saw someone who needed help and you helped. That kind of simple human kindness. It's what I spent my career protecting, but I had forgotten what it felt like to receive it. The morning crowd began filtering in, and Maria returned to her hosting duties, but she kept an eye on James's table. She noticed that the other regulars greeted him warmly, and he responded with the same quiet friendliness he had always shown. Mrs. Chen brought him a small origami crane she had made, and Tom engaged him in a discussion about a recent news article. Around 10:30, as the breakfast crowd was thinning out, James approached the counter where Maria was working on inventory. He placed several bills on the counter, more money than she had ever seen him with before. "James, what's this for?" "It's payment for all the meals you've given me over the past few weeks." The consulting work in Washington came with compensation. Maria pushed the money back toward him. "I don't want payment for that. Maria, I need to pay for those meals. Not because I don't appreciate the kindness, but because accepting charity when I didn't actually need it feels wrong now." She understood. This was about his dignity, about being able to contribute rather than just receive. "All right," she said, "but I'm giving you a frequent customer discount, and Roberto's wife is still on her diet, so don't be surprised if extra food keeps appearing." James laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent and more genuine. "Some things never change, do they?" "The important things shouldn't change," Maria agreed. As James prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Maria, I want you to know that I'm staying in the neighborhood. I found a small apartment a few blocks away. This restaurant, this community, it's where I want to rebuild my life." "What about your military career? Will you go back to consulting?" "Maybe occasionally if they really need my expertise, but that's not going to be my whole life anymore. I'm thinking about teaching. Maybe working with other veterans who are struggling with transition issues. Dr. Chen thinks I might be good at helping people who are dealing with similar challenges." Maria smiled. "I think you'd be excellent at that." "I learned from the best," James said, gesturing around the restaurant. "This place taught me that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and kindness regardless of their circumstances. That's a lesson worth passing on." After James left, Maria continued her morning routine, but with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. The man who had been a mystery was now a friend, and the simple act of kindness that had started their relationship had grown into something that had changed both their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated. 3 months had passed since James Mitchell's true identity was revealed, and the rhythm of life at Abuela's kitchen had settled into a new normal that felt both familiar and wonderfully different. James now came in every morning as a paying customer, though Maria and Roberto still insisted on occasionally making too much food for various creative reasons. More importantly, James had become an integral part of the restaurant's community in ways that went far beyond his daily breakfast routine. The first sign of James's growing involvement came when he noticed Maria struggling with the restaurant's outdated point of sale. System 1 particularly busy morning. The register had frozen in the middle of the breakfast rush, causing a backup of increasingly impatient customers. Without being asked, James had stepped behind the counter and quickly diagnosed the problem, implementing a temporary fix that got them through the morning rush. "How did you know how to do that?" Maria had asked later, amazed at his technical skills. "Military logistics requires a lot of different competencies," James had replied with a modest shrug. "You learn to fix whatever's broken with whatever tools you have available." That incident led to James taking an informal role as the restaurant's technology troubleshooter. He updated their point-of-sale system, improved their inventory tracking, and even helped Maria create a simple website for the restaurant. His organizational skills, honed through decades of military service, brought an efficiency to operations that freed Maria to focus more on what she loved most about the business, connecting with customers and maintaining the warm, welcoming atmosphere her grandmother had created. But it was James's work with the community that truly revealed the depth of his character. Word had spread through the neighborhood about the decorated military officer who frequented the small family restaurant, and other veterans began showing up, drawn by the prospect of talking with someone who understood their experiences. The first was Danny Rodriguez, a young Marine who had recently returned from overseas deployment and was struggling with civilian life. He had been sitting alone at a corner table, picking at his food and looking lost. When James approached him with the same gentle confidence Maria had come to recognize. "Mind if I join you?" James had asked, and something in his tone must have communicated understanding, because Danny had nodded. Maria watched from across the restaurant as the two men talked quietly for over an hour. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the change in Danny's posture as James spoke. The way the young man's shoulders relaxed and his expression shifted from isolation to relief. "What did you say to him?" Maria asked James later. "I told him that coming home is sometimes harder than being deployed, and that feeling disconnected doesn't mean he's broken. It means he's human," James replied. "Sometimes people just need to hear that their struggles are normal and that they're not alone." Danny became a regular customer, and through him came other veterans dealing with similar challenges. James began hosting informal gatherings every Wednesday evening, after the restaurant's dinner service, creating a space where veterans could talk openly about their experiences with someone who understood the unique challenges of military to civilian transition. Maria was amazed by James's ability to connect with these men and women. His approach was never clinical or formal. Instead, he created an atmosphere where people felt safe sharing their fears and frustrations. She watched him listen with complete attention, as a former Navy medic talked about survivor's guilt, saw him provide practical advice to an Army sergeant struggling to find civilian employment, and witnessed him simply sit in comfortable silence with a veteran who wasn't ready to talk, but needed to know he wasn't alone. "You're like a counselor," Maria observed one evening as they cleaned up after one of these gatherings. "I'm just someone who's been where they are," James corrected gently. "When you've carried responsibility for other people's lives, coming home and being responsible only for yourself can feel meaningless. These folks need to remember that their service mattered and that they still have value to offer the world." Dr. Chen began attending these Wednesday sessions, providing professional support when needed, but mainly observing James's natural ability to facilitate healing conversations. She later told Maria that James had an instinctive understanding of trauma recovery that complemented his military leadership skills perfectly. "He should be doing this professionally," Dr. Chen said. "I've suggested he consider training as a veterans counselor, but he seems content with the informal approach." The impact on Abuela's kitchen was profound. The Wednesday veteran gatherings brought new customers who often returned with their families throughout the week. The restaurant's reputation grew beyond the immediate neighborhood, with people coming specifically because they had heard about the welcoming environment Maria and James had created. Local media took notice as well. A reporter from the neighborhood newspaper came to write about the veteran support group, and through that story, James's background became more widely known. The article described how a decorated military officer had found healing and purpose in a small family restaurant, and how his presence had created an unexpected community resource for veterans struggling with transition issues. The publicity brought both opportunities and challenges. A local veterans organization offered James a paid position developing transition programs, which he politely declined. A larger restaurant chain approached Maria about franchising the Abuela's Kitchen model, which she firmly rejected. Several military contractors reached out to James about consulting opportunities, most of which he turned down unless they involved veteran welfare issues. "Don't you miss the bigger stage?" Maria asked him one morning as they read through yet another offer for James to join a prestigious consulting firm. James considered the question seriously. "I spent 20 years on the bigger stage, making decisions that affected thousands of people I never met. Now I'm making a difference in the lives of people I see every day, people I care about personally. The scale is smaller, but the impact feels more real." The restaurant itself was thriving in ways Maria had never imagined. The steady flow of veterans and their families had stabilized the business financially, and the positive community attention had attracted new customers who were drawn to the restaurant's reputation for warmth and acceptance. Maria was able to hire a second full-time employee and give Roberto a well-deserved raise. But perhaps the most significant change was in James himself. The haunted look that had characterized his early visits was completely gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and contentment that seemed to grow stronger each week. He had found an apartment in the neighborhood and furnished it simply but comfortably. He had started dating again, a kind teacher named Lisa who worked at the local elementary school and who understood both his past and his current mission. "You saved my life," James told Maria one quiet morning as they sat together after the breakfast rush. "I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. When you first brought me that meal, I was at the lowest point I'd ever experienced. I had lost everything that mattered to me and couldn't see a way forward." "You saved yourself," Maria replied. "I just gave you a place to figure things out. You gave me more than that. You gave me back my humanity. You reminded me that kindness exists without conditions, that community is real, and that everyone deserves dignity regardless of their circumstances. Those lessons became the foundation for everything I've built since then." As Maria looked around her grandmother's restaurant that morning, she realized that the simple act of feeding a hungry stranger had created something far beyond what she could have imagined. It had saved a man's life, created a community resource, strengthened her business, and enriched her own life in ways she was still discovering. The story was far from over, but this chapter had a completeness to it that felt deeply satisfying. Sometimes, Maria thought, the most important changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness. 1 year after that first rainy evening when Maria Santos crossed the street with a warm meal for a stranger, Abuela's kitchen had become something neither she nor James Mitchell could have envisioned. The small family restaurant had evolved into a cornerstone of the community, known not just for its authentic food, but for its role as a place where people found healing, purpose, and connection. The transformation was evident from the moment visitors walked through the front door. The walls now displayed photos from community events, certificates of appreciation from veteran organizations, and artwork created by local children. A small bookshelf near the entrance held books donated by customers with a sign reading, "Take one, leave one. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied," a phrase James had suggested based on something his late wife Sarah used to say. The Wednesday evening veteran support group had grown from a handful of participants to over 30 regular attendees, requiring Maria to rearrange the restaurant's layout to accommodate the larger gatherings. James had partnered with Dr. Chen to develop a more structured program that included job placement assistance, family counseling referrals, and peer mentorship opportunities. What had started as informal conversations had become a model program that other communities were now trying to replicate. On this particular anniversary morning, Maria arrived early to find a surprise waiting for her. A small placard had been placed beside the front door, recognizing Abuela's Kitchen as an official community partner by the State Veterans Affairs Department. James stood nearby, looking pleased but slightly embarrassed by the attention. "When did this happen?" Maria asked, reading the official designation. "Dr. Chen submitted an application months ago," James explained. "Apparently, what we've been doing here meets all the criteria for a community-based veteran support program. It comes with some funding to help offset the costs of hosting the support groups." Maria was touched but not surprised. The unofficial nature of their veteran outreach had always felt right to her. It emerged naturally from the restaurant's culture of welcome, rather than being imposed from outside. The official recognition validated their approach while providing resources to expand their impact. The morning breakfast crowd arrived with its usual mix of construction workers, hospital staff, retirees, and veterans. Maria noticed how naturally the different groups interacted now, with conversations flowing across tables and genuine friendships forming between people who might never have met otherwise. Mrs. Chen was teaching basic Mandarin phrases to Danny Rodriguez, who was preparing for a job with an international shipping company. Tom, the retired teacher, was helping a veteran's spouse study for her GED. The community that had grown around the restaurant felt organic and sustainable. Around mid-morning, an unexpected visitor arrived. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes approached the counter, looking around the restaurant with obvious interest. "Excuse me, are you Maria Santos?" she asked. "Yes, I am. How can I help you?" "My name is Patricia Williams, and I believe you knew my son-in-law, James Mitchell." "I'm Sarah's mother." Maria felt her breath catch. Sarah's mother, James's late wife's mother. She looked toward James's table where he sat with his usual morning coffee and saw that he had gone completely still. "Mrs. Williams," Maria said softly. "Of course. James has told me so much about Sarah. Please come in." Patricia Williams looked toward James, and the two of them stared at each other across the restaurant for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Then James stood up slowly and walked toward them, his expression showing a mixture of love, grief, and uncertainty. "Patricia," he said quietly. "Hello, James." They embraced carefully, like people who cared deeply for each other, but were navigating complicated emotional territory. Maria realized she was witnessing a moment of profound significance and quietly stepped away to give them privacy. From across the restaurant, she watched as James and Patricia sat together at his usual table. Their conversation was animated but quiet, with both of them occasionally wiping away tears. After about an hour, Patricia stood to leave, but not before stopping at the counter to speak with Maria. "I want to thank you," Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. "When Sarah died, James disappeared from our lives. We understood why. The grief was too much for all of us, but we missed him terribly. We were his family too." "He's mentioned how close you all were," Maria replied. "Dr. Chen contacted me a few months ago to tell me about this place, about what James has been doing here. She thought it might be time for us to reconnect. I wasn't sure James would want to see me, but I had to try." "How did it go?" Patricia smiled through her tears. "He's invited me to come back next week. He wants to show me the veteran support program and meet some of the people he's been helping. He said Sarah would have loved what you've all created here." After Patricia left, James returned to the counter where Maria was pretending to be busy with paperwork. "That looked like a good conversation," she said carefully. "It was," James confirmed. "Patricia and we avoided each other after Sarah died because being together made the loss feel more real. But today, talking with her, it felt like celebrating Sarah's memory instead of just mourning her absence." "That's beautiful, James." Patricia wants to get involved with the support group. She was a social worker before she retired, and she thinks she might be able to help with some of the family counseling aspects. Sarah always said her mother could fix anything if you gave her enough time and the right tools. Maria smiled. "It sounds like this place is about to gain another valuable volunteer." "It sounds like I'm about to get my mother-in-law back," James said, and Maria could hear both joy and relief in his voice. That afternoon, local television news arrived to do a feature story about the restaurant's veteran support program. The reporter interviewed Maria, James, several program participants, and Dr. Chen, creating a piece that would air during the evening news and later be picked up by national media outlets. "How did this all start?" the reporter asked Maria during her interview. Maria looked across the restaurant to where James was helping a young veteran fill out a job application, then back at the camera. "It started with seeing someone who needed help and doing what my grandmother taught me to do. Share what you have. Everything else grew from there, one relationship at a time." "Do you think you've changed James Mitchell's life?" "I think we've changed each other's lives," Maria replied. "And more importantly, we've learned that when you create a space where people feel valued and supported, they naturally want to extend that same kindness to others. It becomes a cycle that just keeps growing." That evening, after the restaurant closed and the film crew had packed up their equipment, Maria and James sat together at his usual table, sharing a quiet dinner and reflecting on how dramatically their lives had changed since that first rainy night. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't brought me that meal?" James asked. Maria considered the question. "I think you would have found your way eventually. Good people usually do." "Maybe," James agreed. "But I'm grateful it happened the way it did. This place, these people, this community we've built together. It's exactly what Sarah and I always dreamed about when we talked about what we'd do after I retired from the military." "She would be proud of you," Maria said softly. "She would be proud of all of us," James corrected. Sarah believed that everyone has something valuable to contribute, and that the secret to a meaningful life is figuring out how to use your gifts in service of something bigger than yourself. As they sat in the warm glow of the restaurant's lights, surrounded by the photos and mementos that told the story of the community they had helped create, Maria realized that the simple act of kindness that had brought them together had become something far more significant than either of them had imagined. It had become a demonstration of how ordinary people, through small acts of compassion and dedication, could create extraordinary changes in the world around them. The story that had begun with a homeless veteran and a restaurant owner had become a story about the power of human connection, the importance of community, and the remarkable things that can happen when people choose kindness over indifference. It was a story that would continue to unfold, one morning conversation and one shared meal at a time, in a little restaurant where everyone was welcome and everyone mattered.